All right, we are 1 Peter chapter 4 this morning, and next week we go into 1 Peter 5 and finish this trimester. Next trimester we just continue on in 2 Peter, and we'll continue our study through the New Testament. But we are in 1 Peter this morning. We're ready for chapter 4. The theme of the book, as we have mentioned, is being holy in all of our conduct. Chapter 1, 15 and 16, I think, sets the pace for that chapter and the book. And that is that we're to be holy in all of our conduct. Be holy, for He is holy. Now let's review where we've been. Chapter 1, what was it about? A call to holiness. Chapter 2, what was it about? Privileges and duties of holiness. Very good. Chapter 3. More duties of holiness. So far we've seen a call to holiness and duties of holiness. So what we saw in chapter 1, here's this call. Here's a number of reasons why you ought to be holy. And because these principles are true, therefore you ought to be holy. Chapter 2, we dealt with various duties and responsibilities as well as privileges. And then chapter 3, duties of husbands, duties of wives, duties toward each other, duties when you're persecuted. But take note of the fact, because we're going to start on this note, that Christ is an example of suffering. He starts on that note here in just a moment to make another point. But anyway, he deals with further duties of holiness. Let's go to question number 4 for this morning. And that is, without reading the whole question, well, here's what chapter 1, chapter 2, 3 is about. So what's chapter 4 about? What's the point of chapter 4? Yeah, living a holy and a pure life. Living a holy and a pure life. I call it a holy life is a pure life. You do what you want with that. If you're making chapter titles in your Bible, you may give it a different title that you think better suits the summary of the chapter, but it seems to focus on a holy life, which we talk about in chapter 1, the whole book is about, is a pure life. And evidence of that would be verses 1 to 3, particularly as we get on even on to verse 6, but verses 1 to 3 talk about how we've wasted enough of our lifetime living in the will of the Gentiles, doing the will of the Gentiles, and now we're to live this holy and pure life and a life unto God. More about that here in just a moment. All right, here are 3 things that take place in this chapter that we're going to focus on. The first is that we're to put away our past life. He's telling those to whom he's writing, it's a general epistle again, as we've mentioned, that they're to put away their past life. And verses 7 through 11 is you're to live unto God. Live your life devoted unto God. And then we may have to suffer as a Christian. And if you suffer as a Christian, you have no reason to be ashamed, but you're glorifying God. 3 things happen in this holy life as a pure life. So how does this last section relate to the rest of that? And I think his point in that is, in part at least, that in spite of the persecution, in spite of the pressure that is on, you still must maintain a pure life and a holy life. There is no excuse for not living a holy and a pure life. Questions or comments before we get underway? Let's go to question number 1. What sins are listed in verses 1 to 6 that are to be put away? All right. Yes, all of those are mentioned right here at verse 3. Anything else? All right, we'll come back to that list here in just a second. Let's look at what we have here in our outline. Put away your past life, verses 1 to 6. I divided that into 2 sections. And the verses 1 and 2 is arm yourself with the same mind of Christ. What same mind? That he just mentioned. That's why I mentioned that a moment ago. Come back to that. And then the next thing he mentions in 3 to 6 is enough time has been spent already in sin. So why do I need to live this pure life and put that away? Because we've wasted enough of our lifetime. Whatever time you spend in sin is enough time wasted, and so it's time to move on to a life of service to God. That's his point in 3 to 6. So let's talk about verses 1 and 2. Let's start at verse 1 and get the point. Therefore, since Christ suffered for us, we're learning in our study on Wednesday night, which we probably already or should have already known. Anytime we see the word therefore, it points backward to something already said. So chapter 2 had just mentioned, verse 18, for Christ also suffered once for sin, the just for the unjust. He gives Christ as an example of suffering, that we should endure suffering. And so he makes a play off of that to drive another point. Not only that Christ is an example of suffering, but the mindset that Christ had that caused him to endure that suffering. So let's go back to verse 1 and get the point. Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same mind. Now stop there. We'll get the rest of that sentence in a moment. I think the first thing, point A1, is look to the example of Christ who endured suffering. What mindset was in his mind that enabled him to go through the suffering of the trials of his Roman trial, his Jewish trial, his scourging, and finally and ultimately his death? Yeah, that his mindset was, I want to do the will of the Father, not as I will, but as thou wilt. Remember that? Matthew 26. It was that mindset that in spite of the suffering, even though that doing the will of the Father is going to increase my suffering, even though doing the will of the Father means I have to endure suffering, I want to do the will of the Father. That mindset. So his point is, arm yourself. Now that's an interesting phrase at verse 1, arm yourself. What does that suggest to you? Forget all the things surrounding, just the phrase arm yourself. What does that suggest? Prepare yourself? You're in the military. What does that mean if your superior said arm yourself?
If they tell me to prepare for war, I would gather up all the equipment and all of the stuff that I would need in order to accomplish the mission, or otherwise to follow the law, will of the Father. You need to gather up all your soul, your being, your thoughts.
All right.
And apply it.
You're right. Two things usually are involved in arming yourself. One is you arm yourself to advance the cause, to maybe attack the enemy, right? But you also arm yourself primarily to defend. Yes, defend yourself. With this mindset, verse 1, that Christ had, that mindset, I'm going to do the will of the Father, even though it brings suffering, is going to protect you, not from the suffering, but it's going to protect you spiritually. You see that? And it's going to advance the cause against the enemy of Christ. Does that make sense? That's what you do when you arm yourself. So arm yourself with the mind of Christ. So have that same mindset, that same attitude. All right? Secondly, the one who suffers in the flesh has ceased from sin. So let's see what does that mean? The one who has suffered in the flesh. Not talking about Christ, he's talking about us. Because Christ hadn't ceased from sin, has he? If he stopped sin, that implies that he had sinned. There was no sin, Hebrews 4. So he's not talking about Christ, but he's talking about us, or those to whom he writes. What does that mean?
You're finished with sin. To me, if you suffered, that means you had enough and you're willing to live that holy life.
All right. Exactly. I don't think he's saying if you're suffering, that's evidence you've quit sin. Are there people who are practicing sin who suffer? Well, sure there are. But in this context, to continue to press doing what's right, continuing to do what's right and live holy and godly, in spite of the pressure, means that's going to increase suffering in the midst of persecution. And the one who suffered has ceased from sin. That is, he's done with sin. He's the one who's willing to have this mindset that I'm willing to go through whatever suffering, he's done with sin. In fact, some translations, I won't take the time to trace them. I think one translation at least used the phrase, he's done with sin. He's finished with sin. I don't want to be a part of that anymore. Does that make sense? All right, now verse 2 says, spend the rest of your lifetime in the will of God and not in lust. Let's get verse 2. For, here's an explanation of the phrase we just analyzed. For he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lust of men, but for the will of God. There's your mindset that we're to arm ourselves with. So he's saying in verses 1 to 3, arm yourself with the same mind of Christ. What does that mean? Well, I need to look to his example. What was going through his mind that caused him to endure? I need that same mindset. When I do that, I'm willing to stop and cease from sin, and I'm going to have this attitude. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life in sin. I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing the will of God. So therefore, a holy life is a pure life. Make sense? All right. Now let's start at verse 4 now, or verse 3, I'm sorry, and go through verse 6. Verse 3 says, for we spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles. What's that mean?
Walking in sin, because the Gentiles was a heathen, emulating their lives after sin instead of after God.
All right. That's true. What else? We've wasted enough time in sin. Do you ever hear anyone say that let them sow their wild oats? You know, they're young, let them live life. Let them experience the world and let them sow their wild oats and they'll come to their senses later. Whatever time has been spent in sin, I don't care if it's a day or a year or 10 years, whatever time has been spent in sin is enough time wasted. Because that's that much time you're not serving the Lord. That's that much time you're not glorifying God. But anyway, whatever the case may be, look at verse 3 again. When we walked in, and here's a list of sins. So let's go to question 2. We'll not get all of those. We'll get the rest of them later. We're going to define 3 of those. The first one that's mentioned is licentiousness. What is that? What's licentiousness? Question number 2. Define licentiousness. Say again. Unbridled lust. All right. Anybody have a different translation? Sensuality. Yes. Sensuality. Some of the sensualities, the English Standard, New American Standard. Some of the New King James will have less, as mine does, licentiousness. Some of them have lewdness, depending on what year yours was produced. Anything else? Lasciviousness, lewdness, sensuality. Unrestrained behavior, yes. Unchaste. In fact, Thayer says unchaste handling of males and females. That's interesting what that word means. And so it has to do with unrestrained, wanton conduct. The next thing that he mentions is revelries, or lust, rather. What's lust? We don't have time to delve into each one of these in depth. Passions. And obviously these are passions for things contrary to the will of God. And so we followed after lewdness, lasciviousness, lust, drunkenness. Doesn't need much comment. We know what drunkenness is. What's revelries? Back to question 2. All right, yeah. Riotous drinking parties, excess feasting, boisterous parties. In fact, some of your translations may use a phrase riotous parties or something equivalent to that. Drinking parties, the New King James says. Banqueting, the King James. What's that refer to? Social drinking, in essence. Drinking that is not necessarily excessive, R.C. Trench, a lexicographer says. Drinking bouts, drinkings, a social gathering at which wine is served, BDAG says. All right, we'll come back to question 2 and the other 3 things mentioned there. Let's get the rest of this at verse 3. Then there is abominable idolatries, which would include what? Worshipping idols. Colossians 3 identifies something else as idolatry. Covetousness is idolatry. That would be included. So he gives a sampling of the sins of the past life that may be peculiar to those to whom he wrote. Those are to be put away. Now, verse 4 and 5. What's the point of 4 and 5? Absolutely. They think it's strange. Look at verse 4. That you do not run with them to the same flood of dissipation. The English Standard says the flood of debauchery. The New International says reckless wild living. In other words, instead of you looking at them as odd for living a life of sin, they look at you odd for trying to live so pure. What do you mean you don't drink? What do you mean you're not going to go to this wild party? How could you see anything wrong with? Etc. They think it's quite strange.
Even if you have never run with them, people that know that you don't do that will think you're very odd.
They think you're odd. I want you to notice two things in verse 4. They think it's strange, and then what do? End of verse 4. They speak evil of you, even though you're doing things pure. They get drunk, and you say, I don't drink, and they speak evil of you. They're involved in lasciviousness, and you live pure, and they speak evil of you. Not the other way around. Now, verse 5, what does verse 5 help us with? They're going to be judged for that. They think it's strange, and so they speak evil of you, but remember this, they'll give an account because God is ready to judge the living and the dead. They'll give an account for that. So don't let that discourage you. Now let's go to verse 6. The gospel was preached to this end. And I think the point there is to live according to God. For this reason, the gospel was also preached to those who were dead. I'm not convinced that that's talking about, in fact, I'm convinced it's not talking about that they were preached, that preaching was done to those who are dead, unless that refers to those who are spiritually dead. And I think it's talking about those who are now dead. In fact, some translations, I believe it's the English Standard, the Holman's Christians, and the New Century, the gospel was preached to those who are now dead. They weren't dead at the time they were preached to, but they're now dead, is what I take it to mean. But anyway, the gospel was preached to those who are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. Regardless of what the dead may mean, let's not get focused on that. What's the point of verse 6? Say again. You're still going to be judged according to your conduct. That's right.
I think that Donnie, he's also alluding to the gospel is preached to everyone throughout the whole world. That he's talking about the dead. That means that even the dead can hear the gospel of God being preached so much.
All right, the gospel is preached to everyone. I think his thrust is this. The whole point here, let's follow the context. Put away your past life. Arm yourself with this same mind of Christ. And if you have that mindset, then you're going to put away sin. And so now it's time that we've wasted enough time putting our lives into sin. And the world's going to think it's strange. But remember this, now at verse 6. I think his point is this. Remember this, that the gospel that you have embraced was preached to you and everyone else for this purpose. That you might live unto God. Does that make sense? Let's read again verse 6. For this reason the gospel was preached. Now forget about those who are dead for a moment. Now we've commented on that. I'm not afraid to deal with that. But let's not get bogged down. For this reason the gospel was preached, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. In other words, the gospel was preached, not so that you would try to live in harmony with men so that they're not harsh with you. The gospel was preached that you might live to God. And live in harmony with God and live holy unto God. That's why the gospel was preached. And so live in harmony with that. Does that make sense? Yeah. Now what does it mean to live at verse 6? What does it mean to live according to God in the Spirit? Well, the answer to that is, he's about to tell us in 7 through 11. I don't have to guess at that. He's about to tell me what that means. So we're going to find out what that means. This is why the gospel was preached, so you would live in this manner. Not just preach for us to understand it and then believe it and say, okay, that's good. It's to change our life. The whole purpose of the gospel being preached was to change the lives of men. Does that make sense? All right. Yes, ma'am.
In chapter 3, verse 18, it says, "The price of
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any questions, comments? 1 to 6. Gets even harder as time goes on. Good point. Good point. All right, let's look at verses 7 through 11. I don't know who I borrowed this from. I don't remember where I got this several years ago before we get to verse 7. Someone called this the 4 R's of putting away sin. There's the resolve, verse 2. And the point of verse 2 is I'm going to spend the rest of my life not doing the will of men but the will of God. Secondly, the reason I've spent enough of my past in sin. Third, the reaction, they're going to think you strange. And fourth, remember there's a judgment to come. Those 4 R's will help us to put away sin in our lives. All right, let's talk about verses 7 through 11 here. Not everything that's found there is on the screen yet. It'll be there in a moment. But we're to live unto God. Now, verse 7 is a little controversial. And I want us to focus on that in just a moment. Then we'll run through the list of things. But the end of all things is at hand. Therefore, and we'll finish what the therefore is in a moment. Let's talk about the end of all things is at hand. The question among commentators about the end of all things is, what's he talking about? Well, whatever the end is, it's at hand. And that's the question the commentators grapple with. If it is at hand, means it's near. And so many think that that cannot refer to the second coming because it wasn't near. It wasn't about to happen. And yet others argue, like Hamilton, Clinton Hamilton in his work, and he's an excellent student, that does not always mean, at hand does not always mean it's imminent. It can point to distant future. And I'll not go through all of those evidences of that. I tend to think that those who think that it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem are correct. That the end of the Jewish nation, the end is coming. And that's probably what it refers to, at least in my mind. And you say, well, I think it's talking about the end of time. And so how do I harmonize it's at hand? Well, there's a couple of things that Hamilton observes. He says, one, like Romans 13 talks about, that now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. So it doesn't matter how far the judgment day is out. Let's say it's 10,000 years from now. Today, it's closer than it was yesterday. And tomorrow, it's closer than it was today. And so it's nearer in that sense. Perhaps. That's what he's talking about. Hamilton argues that maybe he's talking about his wording was let me get his wording here. The cessation of the redemptive age is coming. If that confuses you, then join the club. But I think I know what he's talking about. And he argues that it has to refer to that, and it cannot refer to the Jewish destruction the destruction of Jerusalem. I'm not in agreement with that. I want to think he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. But you do with it what you want. But here's the point. Whatever he's talking about, I think we're going to come to the same conclusion. It has application ultimately to the end of time. There is something coming that is going to be a judgment and at least a trial for Christians. So whether that's the destruction of Jerusalem, which doesn't apply to us, for us, the end of time is coming. We don't know when. And it's closer now than it's ever been. So I don't want us to get bogged down on what is the end that is near as much as what he's saying we do in view of that. But I'm going to leave that for the moment. But notice what he says. The end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be what? Yeah. Yeah. Therefore, be serious and watchful in your prayers. So one translation may use the word sober. One may use the self-control. One translation may use the idea of being serious. Anything else you're seeing in 1 Peter 4 and in verse 7? You're serious and watchful, one translation says. Self-controlled and sober-minded, English Standard, of a sound mind. Think clearly and control yourselves, in NCV. NIV says be alert and sober-minded. What's all that mean? Suppose someone asks you, just summarize and make that simple. What's all of this sober-minded, self-discipline, of sound judgment? Be alert, discipline yourselves, be watchful. What's all that mean? All right, it's involved in doing the will of God. What else?
I would think at this point, due to the persecution, he's probably trying to tell them not to get bogged down with all of that that's going on. Keep your mind straight, that's gonna happen, whatever you do.
Yeah.
Keep your mind straight, keep focused, and you will win in the end.
I think there's something to that. In that, if my understanding of the end of all things is at hand, may refer to the destruction of Jerusalem, and if our date be understood correctly, we're no more than 5 or 6 years away from that destruction. And as that pressure comes on, then you be alert, be sober, be clear-minded, don't be distracted, and you live like you ought to be living. And I think the latter part of the chapter is going to help us with that. And you be serious. And you watch unto prayer. So what does it mean to live unto God? Be sober, be serious-minded. Verse 7, pray. What does verse 8 suggest? Above all things, love one another. How does love cover a multitude of sins? Does that mean love just overlooks sin? Yes. Yes. It's not saying love overlooks sin, because he's told us earlier we need to put sin out of our lives, and we ought to encourage people to put sin out of their lives. It doesn't mean if you love someone you just overlook sin. It means that it's forgiving. God can hide a multitude of sins. It has to do with forgiveness. That's what it's talking about. Love is forgiving. And so love one another, and as you love one another, you're forgiving of one another, and you help them overcome sin. Then he mentions verse 9, hospitality. What is hospitality? Question number 2 again. What does hospitable mean? It literally means to entertain strangers, be friendly to strangers, generous to guests. But he says, do so without grumbling. What does grumbling mean? Question 2. Say what? Complaining? Okay. What else? Murmuring, complaining. A.T. Robertson says, complaint spoils hospitality. That's interesting. In other words, you're trying to be gracious to someone, but grumbling about having to do that kind of spoils it, doesn't it? Then what else does he mention? I'm going to forego the quote from Wood, which is excellent. 10 and 11. Let's group them together. What do you see in 10 and 11, which has to do with being good stewards of the manifold grace of God? In other words, God's been gracious to us, and so you be good stewards of the grace. So here's what that means. Verse 11. If you speak, speak as the oracles of God. What's the oracles? Your footnote will help you. The sayings of God. So we have a responsibility to live according to God in what we say and in what we do. So if you're going to talk in harmony with the will of God. If you're going to speak in harmony with the will of God. Don't ever give someone advice that doesn't harmonize with the will of God. Don't ever instruct somebody that doesn't harmonize with the will of God. Don't ever teach someone unless it harmonizes with the will of God. If you speak, speak as the oracles of God. That only applies to preachers, right? Why? Why do you say no? Yeah, the disciples that are dispersed. So if they speak, they're also to speak in harmony with the will of God, right? But then notice what else he says. If anyone ministers, let him do it as with the ability that God supplies. What is that talking about? If he ministers, serves, as you serve others, perhaps it refers to benevolence. And so how obligated are you in benevolence? Only as far as, look at the word in the text, as you're able, your ability. Some are more able than others, but you have some ability and you minister with what ability you have, or you serve. It may not, I think it's probably broader than benevolence, but as you serve others, you serve with the ability that you have. Some have greater ability than others to serve, maybe time, money, etc. So whatever you say and whatever you do, your words and your actions are all to be designed, into verse 11, to glorify God. That's what that's all about. Live unto God, verses 7 through 11. Now let's talk about suffering as a Christian in the time we have left. And so you're going to suffer as you're living this life of holy and a pure life, because they think it's strange and they speak evil of you. So, verse 12, he starts on this note. It's nothing strange to suffer as a Christian. Do not think it's strange concerning the fiery trial, which is to try you as though something strange has happened to you. What's he saying? Yeah, don't ask why me. Good point. Yeah. And so you try to live godly and you're going to get some blowback from the world. And so don't throw up your hands and say, why? I don't understand. It's going to happen to you. That just happens. Don't think it's strange when you suffer because you're doing what's right. All right, verses 13 and 14. His point is to rejoice. What does he mean? He said, but rejoice, verse 13, and then at the end of verse 13, be glad with exceeding joy. And then he says at verse 14, blessed are you. What's he mean? Yeah. If you were part of what they're doing, you wouldn't be suffering. So your suffering is evidence, if you're suffering for the cause of right, is evidence you're doing what's right. That's an occasion to rejoice. You're not rejoicing because you're suffering. Boy, I sure am glad I'm suffering. I'm glad they're persecuting me. I'm glad they're ridiculing me. I'm glad they're threatening me. I'm glad that this is evidence that I'm trying to do what's right. And it's evidence I'm enduring so far, is it not? And I'm also going to rejoice for another reason at the end of verse 14. On their part, they're blaspheming you. But as I'm suffering, God's glorified. God is glorified as I go through that endurance. Now, let's get 15 and 16. He focuses on that, God being glorified. But let none of you suffer as an evildoer, a thief, a murderer, an evildoer, a thief, or as a busybodies in other people's matters. Let's pause for a moment and get question number 2 again. What is a busybody? Absolutely. One who meddles in affairs that's not their own affairs. And don't suffer as a busybody. Or, isn't it interesting how many passages do this? Take some extreme sins in one direction and what we may think of as a minor sin in another and groups them all together. A murderer and a busybody is grouped in the same class. Don't suffer as a murderer or as an evildoer or as a thief. Now those are pretty bad. And a busybody. So don't do that either. But if you suffer as a Christian, don't be ashamed but glorify God on that behalf. God's glorified. Now, in interest of time, let's move on to 17 to 19. You suffer in view of the judgment. Now, there's a little question as to what this is about, so let's see if we can get 17 and 18, at least if we don't get to 19 in the time that remains. For the time has come that judgment must begin at the house of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel? So what is he talking about? Some think that he's talking about the end time judgment, and at the end time that judgment begins with God's people first. I'm not convinced that's what he's talking about. I think if our understanding earlier of the end of all things is at hand may refer to the destruction of Jerusalem, I think it probably applies to that here. That judgment, the Jews were respected and revered, or at least thought of, at least they themselves thought of themselves as God's people, and they were. That the time has come that judgment must begin at the house of God. And if it begins there, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel? I think his point is this, that, and the principle is going to apply, I think, ultimately to the end of time. But I think his point is this, that going through this trying time of the destruction of Jerusalem, it's going to be difficult for the people of God who have God working for them and God on their side. How much more so is it going to be difficult in the midst of problems for one who has no respect for God and has never obeyed the gospel? Now notice the comment at verse 18. He quotes from the Old Testament, from Proverbs 11 and 31. If the righteous one is scarcely saved, scarcely means with difficulty. In other words, he goes through trials, he goes through tribulations. That's what he's talking about. Where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? In other words, you think it's bad to go through the trials and the sufferings and the tribulation and ultimately be saved, but it's bad going through that. It's going to be worse if you are not a child of God. You're going to be totally lost. That's quite simplistic. There's going to be a great trial during that destruction of Jerusalem. Matthew 24 so teaches. Now let's get verse 19 and see if we can't wrap that together and make some sense. Therefore let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to him in doing good as the faithful creator. In other words, here's what you're going to do in the midst of trials and midst of tribulation. You're going to suffer. Don't think it's strange. Rejoice. You're going to end up glorifying God, but do that in view of judgment, because if judgment is beginning at the house of God, and God's going to bring judgment on his own people, what's going to happen to those that don't even submit to him at all? They have no chance. They have no hope. And so endure, commit your soul, and endure through that suffering. Does that make sense? All right, questions or comments? We may have time for one or two practical lessons. List some things. Question number 5 that's practical from this chapter. What did you learn from this chapter that you say, that's practical, I'm going to take that home with me? What did you learn? All right. What else? The world's going to think it's strange that you don't act like them. That's one of the things we learn. And the world will speak evil of you just because your life condemns them. We didn't talk much about that. But so the question may come, why do they speak evil when I'm trying to do what's right? I'm just trying to be honest and they condemn me. I'm just trying to work hard and they condemn me. Why do they do that? And it's because your example condemns them. You made a change and they don't like the change, not because they don't respect to some degree the godly life you're now living. You just pronounce condemnation on them by changing your life. You're saying that what they're doing is not good, just by your example. And that's why they condemn you. One more practical lesson. Somebody.
Verse 11 talks about speaking the oracles of God. We always should not say book, chapter, and verse on one night.
Good point. We'll stop on that note. Chapter 5, and we'll wind this up next time.